Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Rudy Estrada. I want to talk very briefly about the letters of Paul, the letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. Now, when we're thinking about the letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, if you open up your Bible, you will notice that there are only two letters. There's First Corinthians and Second Corinthians. But in reality, when we read closely these two letters, we get the hint that there was actually something else going on, and that Paul was having a more lengthier conversation with this community. And for some strange reason, we don't have the full story to their conversation. When we read First Corinthians, we come across a couple of passages that indicate to us that Paul had previously written this community a letter. For example, when you read First Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through 11, Paul says the following. He says, I wrote you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. I did not at all mean with immoral people of this world or with the covetous and the swindlers or the idolaters, but actually I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he's an immoral person. Notice here in these passages that Paul seems to indicate the existence of a previous letter that he had written to this church. He tells them that he wrote to them, but they don't really seem to understand the implications of his ethical exhortations. And so he's writing now in this letter to explain further what he meant in the previous letter. Likewise, when we read a little bit later, a couple of chapters later in 1 Corinthians 7, we can also notice that 1 Corinthians, what we have here in the New Testament, is not the only correspondence between Paul and the Corinthians. And in fact, it seems like they wrote to Paul and they responded to his first letter. And in 1 Corinthians 7:1, it says the following. Now concerning the things about which you wrote. That little phrase there, the things about which you wrote, indicates to us that as Paul is writing this letter, he actually has perhaps in hand their letter to him. And in fact, he seems to be responding to some of the questions that they have. This helps us recognize that Paul had written and he also had received a letter from the Corinthians before he wrote what we now call First Corinthians. So this kind of makes us think a little bit differently about the correspondence, or at least the dialogue that Paul is having. Overall, when you're looking at the chronology, or at least the literary correspondences between Paul and this church, we can notice that there's something that seems to happen, and it kind of looks as follows. Paul wrote First Corinthians, and then the church in Corinth actually responded to Paul, and they sent him a letter. And then now Paul writes his second letter to them. But this second letter that he writes to them is actually what we have within our Bibles, and this is what we call First Corinthians. So basically, by the time we get First Corinthians, there has already been an exchange of letters, at least two previous letters between Paul and this church in Corinth. But we don't have these letters. We only have evidence that Paul had seemed to have written previous letters to them. We also know that when you're looking at the New Testament, we don't just have First Corinthians, but we also have Second Corinthians. And when you're looking at Second Corinthians, there's also an additional hint that there was some longer conversation going on between Paul and this church. He states in Second Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. He says, "But I determined this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. For if I cause you sorrow, who then makes me glad but the one whom I made sorrowful? This is the very thing I wrote you, so that when I came, I will not have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice, having confidence in you, all that my joy would be the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart, I wrote to you with many tears, not so that you would be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have especially for you. Reading this statement here in 2 Corinthians gives us an indication that Paul had visited the church. Paul had wrote to them a letter, and that this letter seemed to have caused an emotional disturbance, or at least bothered them. Paul actually describes this as a tearful letter that he wrote to the Corinthians. Likewise, we can notice in 2 Corinthians 7:8 uh, that Paul's letter that he had previously written to them, it caused them much sorrow. And Paul states the following: "For though I caused you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it. For I see that that letter caused you sorrow, though only for a while." Whatever Paul wrote to this church, from this statement here in 2 Corinthians 7:8, it tells us that Paul wrote a very, very harsh, or at least strong letter that would have really caused some reaction by the people in Corinth. Now, is that referring to 1 Corinthians? I don't know if when we read First Corinthians, it gives you that same sense of tone. But this verse here seems to indicate that Paul had written another letter prior to 2 Corinthians, and that this letter itself was a very harsh letter. So going back to the chronology, or at least thinking about the literary relationship between Paul and this church in Corinth, to briefly review, Paul wrote First Corinthians. This is one of the first letters that he wrote. He wrote to the church in Corinth. They seem to respond to him, and they don't really understand the implications of what he is saying. So Paul then sends them another letter. This is his second letter. This second letter that Paul writes to this church is actually the letter that we have within our New Testament, and we call it First Corinthians. There also seems to be a correspondence. They seem to respond to him, or at least send him a message that they didn't appreciate, or they have more questions. And so Paul seems to write another letter to them. And this is what Paul calls a painful letter, or a letter of tears, or of great sorrow. And then the Corinthians respond again to Paul. They respond to him, and Paul follows up. And it's in 2 Corinthians that we can notice that Paul is following up to a previous letter that he had written to them, which he calls a letter of tears. But this last follow-up that Paul sends to them, it's really, in our Bibles, it's called 2 Corinthians. But in reality, it probably is the fourth letter that Paul had written to them. So when we're stitching all of these letters together, especially in light of the fact that Paul had written several others, we can notice that First Corinthians is not really First Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul mentions that he had written a previous letter. In 1 Corinthians 7:1, he mentions that they responded to his letter, and now this letter that he's writing to him is a response. And we could also observe that 2 Corinthians is not really 2 Corinthians. From a couple of passages here in 2 Corinthians, we could read that this was the fourth correspondence that he's writing to this church. And also in 2 Corinthians 13:1, Paul indicates that he's going to the church for the third time. That is very important because it gives us a sense that Paul seems to be visiting the church, traveling to them, talking to them, telling them, giving them some exhortations, telling them how they lived their Christian lives, and they seem to challenge him, or at least respond to him. And Paul needs to write and follow up with all of his letters. So the issue at hand is really the following: we're really missing at least two letters from the Apostle Paul that he wrote to this church in Corinth. And some of us may wonder, well, like, how is it that Paul wrote many other letters that we don't have? That leads us to all sorts of questions, or at least helps us recognize a more of a literary relationship that Paul had with his communities. One other question that we may have is, like, literally, why were these previous letters not preserved? Were the letters too strong? And the people in Corinth didn't like it. Maybe they tore them up and it's like, hey, forget about it. Or they just didn't like what Paul was saying. Overall, we could have some perhaps questions for reflection when we're thinking about letters in the ancient world, or at least Paul's literary relationship with the people in Corinth. It leads us to ask a couple of questions. What are the pastoral implications of these correspondences? We often think about Paul as just someone who writes a letter and the churches respond positively and everyone kind of gets it. But Corinth gives us a different portrait. The people in Corinth seem to disagree with Paul on certain issues, or at least not respond the way Paul expects for them to respond. Another part of that question is it possible that some of Paul's letters were very harsh? We may read Paul's letters and enjoy them for their theological contribution to our understanding of God, of Jesus, the church, the mission of God. But what if Paul wrote some letters that were pretty strong and didn't really sit well with some of the people in Corinth? What does that make us think about Paul and about his pastoral approach to these people in Corinth? The second question I have is really, what do these letters reveal about the way Paul viewed the Corinthians and the way that the Corinthians viewed Paul? He seems to write to this church more than any other church. But why does Paul write so much to this church? What do you think that this suggests? Overall, these are some questions that could make us think, and obviously it's going to be very difficult to find a right or wrong answer. But at least we could reimagine the conversations that Paul was having as an apostle, as someone who went to Corinth, as someone who ministered in this community, and also recognize a more of a human side to Paul's mission. Not everything that he wrote was received um, rightly, or even not everything that he wrote people just automatically just embrace what he said. But we seem to notice in Corinthians that there was some tension between Paul and this church, but we're able to at least have part of the conversation. We have two letters out of the possible four that Paul had wrote, and these letters are very important in our understanding of the church, its context, and the circumstances that many Christians would have experienced during the time of the Apostle Paul.